In the wildest places on Earth, even the most skilled hunters face moments where nature's raw power crashes down without warning, leaving nothing but fear and survival. In this video, you'll hear 6 terrifying encounters, from the icy peaks of Alaska to the dense forests of Russia and the rugged backcountry of Idaho. Danger waits in every shadow. Are you ready to face it? On September 14, 2018, in the rugged backcountry of Alaska's Chugach Range, the air carried the crisp bite of early autumn, the tundra already brushed with red and gold. Dan Mercer, a 43-year-old electrician from Fairbanks with a lifetime of hunting experience, stood with his rifle slung over one shoulder, scanning the rocky creek bed far below. Beside him was his longtime friend, 39-year-old Tyler Briggs, a quiet but determined man who worked as a welder in Anchorage. In front of them was their hired guide, Mike Carlson, a wiry 50-year-old with decades of tracking and survival in the Alaskan wilderness. They had been glassing for hours when they spotted it, a massive grizzly turning over rocks, searching for late-season salmon scraps, its coat thick and dark, shoulders rolling like boulders under a blanket of fur. The bear moved with the slow confidence of an apex predator, every motion unhurried yet deliberate. From the ridge it looked impossibly big, but the distance did nothing to lessen the pressure building in the men's chests. Mike studied the wind, gave a sharp nod, and the three began moving into position. The plan was to close the gap to 100 yards for a clean shot, the steep terrain offering sparse cover in the form of scrub alder and loose, jagged rocks. The breeze was steady at their faces, carrying their scent away from the bear, until the faintest shift in the air told a different story. The wind turned. The grizzly froze mid-step, head lifting high, nostrils flaring, small black eyes locking instantly in their direction. In that heartbeat, stillness shattered into chaos. The bear's head lowered, its muscles bunched, and then it came, an eruption of speed and raw power that seemed impossible for its size, tearing across the ground, throwing gravel and moss into the air. In seconds, it had eaten half the distance, the sound of its pounding strides rolling up the hillside like thunder. Dan dropped to one knee, bracing his rifle, his breath hard and shallow, and when the bear broke the 40-yard line, he squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked across the range, the bullet slamming into the grizzly's shoulder, the impact staggering it but not stopping its momentum. It let out a deep, guttural roar that vibrated through the ground, twisting as it ran, and Tyler's follow-up shot clipped its ribs in a glancing hit. The bear veered sharply, crashing into a wall of dense alder, the vegetation swallowing it in seconds, leaving behind only the shiver of leaves and the heavy pounding of retreating footfalls. For a long moment, none of them moved. The adrenaline surge left their muscles tight, their hearts hammering. But they were still alive. That alone felt like a victory, but it was temporary. Mike knew a wounded grizzly was more dangerous than one unhurt, and this one had not run far. The tracking began slowly, each step deliberate as they followed smears of dark blood on the leaves and deep gouges in the soil where the bear's claws had torn into the earth. The trail led through a tangle of alder so thick they were forced to push through with shoulders hunched, branches snapping against their rifles. Hours passed, the sun climbing and then sinking again, the light growing thinner with each minute. The silence was broken only by the faint calls of distant ravens and the occasional rush of wind through the treetops. Twice the bear's trail disappeared entirely, only to reappear hundreds of yards away, the blood trail faint, but still there. Mike muttered under his breath about the bear's cunning. It was circling, doubling back, testing them. Late in the afternoon, as they moved along a narrow game trail beside a shallow ravine, the air shifted again. This time, the warning came in the form of a deep, explosive huff from somewhere ahead, and before any of them could raise their rifles, the bear erupted from behind a massive fallen log. Its charge was sudden and terrifying, covering ground so fast it seemed to blur, its jaws snapping, the deep rumble in its chest vibrating in their bones. Dan swung his rifle up, but the bear stopped short in a violent bluff, teeth bared, drool stringing from its mouth, the air thick with the musky, sharp scent of its coat. For an endless moment it stared them down, then with a sound like an angry snort it turned and vanished again into the timber, leaving them shaking and drenched in cold sweat. They pressed on, though the daylight was bleeding away, knowing the risk grew with every step. The trail became steeper, climbing toward a ridge choked with roots and moss-slick rock. Every broken branch and overturned stone spoke of the bear's passing, but it was moving slower now. By the time the shadows stretched long and the temperature began to drop sharply, the blood trail led them to the base of a hillside where a massive tangle of roots hung exposed, forming a natural barricade against the slope. There in the dim light they saw it. The grizzly lay bedded down, its chest heaving, its dark eyes lifting to meet theirs with a look that held no fear, only raw defiance. Its fur was matted with blood from its shoulder and ribs, but its muscles still tensed, ready to explode into motion again. Dan steadied himself, every nerve taut, the crosshairs locking just behind the bear's shoulder. He drew in a long breath, feeling the world narrow to the space between him and the animal, and when he exhaled, he pressed the trigger. The rifle's blast cracked through the stillness, and the bear jerked violently, a final roar shaking the ground before it collapsed against the roots, its massive frame shuddering once, then going still. Silence fell over the hillside, heavy and absolute. The three men stood frozen for a moment, the enormity of what had just happened settling in like the first chill of night. When they finally approached, the scale of the animal left them stunned. The grizzly measured 9 feet 9 inches from nose to tail, its head broad and scarred from countless past fights, one ear torn, claws long and curved like blades. Its sheer size spoke of years surviving the harshest conditions Alaska could throw at it, years of dominance in a land where only the strongest endured. It had taken them 10 hours to bring the bear down, 10 hours of tension and danger where each sound in the brush could have been the end. The mountains around them seemed darker now, the wind sharper, and as they began the long, heavy work ahead, each man knew he would carry the memory of this hunt for the rest of his life, not as a moment of triumph, but as a reminder of the razor-thin line between hunter and hunted in the wild heart of Alaska. On January 19, 2022, the Dinaric Alps of Croatia lay buried under a deep, fresh snow, the cold air sharp enough to sting the lungs and the silence broken only by the occasional crack of distant branches under the weight of ice. Luka Vukovic, a 36-year-old forestry worker and seasoned hunter, sat astride his ATV, patrolling the logging trails as part of a large winter boar drive. His task that day was to scout ahead, checking for fresh sign along the narrow, twisting tracks carved between steep ridges and thick spruce stands. The snow under his tires muffled the hum of the engine, every sound absorbed into the frozen stillness. The drive was already in motion, with beaters working the ridge above, their shouts and sticks pushing game downslope toward waiting hunters. Luka had been riding slowly, scanning for tracks and scat, watching for sudden movement along the tree line. The winter forest was a world of shadows and white glare, every shape shifting with the wind, every sound carrying differently in the cold. His gloved hands gripped the handlebars loosely, the ATV idling forward at a steady downhill pace of about 20 kilometers per hour, the path curving ahead in a blind bend. The moment came without warning. A violent eruption of motion exploded from the spruce to his right, a massive boar, close to 150 kilograms, charging low and fast, its dark, bristled coat dusted with snow, tusks glinting pale against the gloom. Startled by the beaters above, it had barreled down the slope in blind panic, its eyes wide and bloodshot, muscles coiled like springs. It hit the trail just meters ahead of Luka, but instead of crossing it drove straight toward the ATV as if intent on smashing through it. The collision was a deafening, jarring impact, the boar's head striking the front of the machine with the full momentum of two bodies moving toward each other. Luka's arms snapped stiff on instinct, but the ATV bucked hard sideways, the handlebars wrenching in his grip, the back tires skidding in the loose snow. The force was more violent than anything he had felt in the mountains, a blunt wall of muscle and bone slamming into steel. The machine tipped, balance gone in an instant, and flipped onto its side, the world tilting into a blur of snow, metal, and shadow. He landed on his left shoulder and hip, the frozen ground knocking the air from his lungs. Pain flared deep in the muscle, but it was the shock that kept him still for a moment, the sound of his own harsh breathing in the cold air. The ATV lay twisted beside him, one handlebar bent in at an unnatural angle, the front rack crumpled, gear scattered in the snow like spilled tools. The boar was already scrambling to its feet, steam rising from its body in the cold. For a moment it stood there, legs braced, head swinging low as if deciding whether to attack again. Luca could see the hard ridge of its spine under the thick winter coat, the tusks chipped and stained, the eyes still bright with panic. Then it turned sharply, diving into the dense spruce at a speed that left no chance to give chase, the heavy brush closing behind it like a door. Snow was falling again, light but constant, already dusting over the tire marks and scattered gear. Luca pushed himself upright, every muscle sore, his left knee throbbing under the weight of his gear. His rifle had slid several meters away, half buried in the snow, and retrieving it felt like moving through water. The radio on his chest plate was still intact, but he held off calling for help immediately, his mind still racing to process the hit. He inspected the ATV. The frame was crooked, one wheel locked at a skewed angle, and the plastic panels were cracked. The handlebars were bent far enough to make steering impossible. It was a machine built to survive rough terrain and heavy loads, yet in seconds the boar had damaged it beyond any chance of driving out. Luca had hunted boar for years, had tracked and taken them in thick brush and open clearings, but never had one charged him with such raw, reckless force. He began walking slowly back toward the main trail, limping slightly from the impact, scanning the snow for more sign of the animal. The only tracks now were scattered hoofprints leading away into the deeper forest, speckled here and there with small flecks of blood. Luca guessed the animal had been clipped earlier in the drive, maybe by a stray pellet that ricocheted through the timber, just enough to wound and panic it without slowing it down. Hours later, after the drive had ended, the beaters who had worked the ridge found the boar lying dead about 200 meters from the collision site, deep in a tangle of undergrowth where the snow lay undisturbed except for the churned ground around its final rest. Its massive shoulders and thick shield of cartilage bore the marks of old fights, one ear ragged from an old tear, its tusks long and sharp enough to open a man in an instant. The wound that had ended it was not from Luca, but from a fragment of a shot that had pierced an artery in its leg earlier in the day. It had bled out slowly, its final moments spent in a blind, furious rush through the forest that had brought it into Luca's path. By the time Luca radioed for recovery, the light was fading, the temperature dropping fast. The ATV would need to be dragged out by sled later, but for now, he was more concerned with getting back to camp before dark. Each step sent a dull ache up his side, his breath turning to clouds in the fading twilight, but he kept moving, following the narrow trail as the snow thickened. The forest around him felt heavier now, the silence deeper, as if the mountains themselves had swallowed the sound of the crash. Back at camp that night, after the gear was stowed and the hunters gathered around the fire, Luca recounted the story with a half smile, turning it into something that made the others laugh. But in the quiet moments afterward, he could still feel the raw impact in his bones, the sudden unstoppable force that had come out of the trees and changed the day in an instant. He knew then, as every hunter in those mountains eventually learned, that in the frozen backcountry, machines meant nothing to a charging tusker. The forest belonged to the animals that could kill without hesitation, and when they decided to come, there was no steel, no skill, no preparation that could truly stop them in time. On August 27, 2019, the summer air on Alaska's Kodiak Island was warm but heavy with the scent of wet earth and fish, the thick forest humming with the noise of insects and the low rush of a nearby salmon stream. 16-year-old Anna Whitmore, tall and lean from years of hiking but still new to hunting, walked a few paces behind her father, Mark, a 44-year-old guide with decades of experience, and her uncle, Brian, a 50-year-old commercial fisherman who spent his off-season chasing big game. The men carried serious stopping power, Mark with a .338 Lapua and Brian with a .375 HH, while Anna, unarmed, carried only a small pack with water, snacks, and extra gear. It was her first bear hunt, and though she tried to match their pace, her eyes kept drifting over the dense, dripping greenery, the moss-draped spruce, and the narrow game trails etched into the forest floor. They were deep in peak season when the salmon runs drew every bear on the island to the streams, and signs of their presence were everywhere. Massive tracks pressed deep into the mud, clawed tree trunks, and the pungent smell of fish guts rotting in the brush. The ground underfoot was slick with rain-soaked leaves, and the air seemed to hold an edge of tension, every bird call and snapping twig amplified. The men moved quietly, scanning the bends of the stream for movement, while Anna lagged, drawn to a tangled patch of berry bushes heavy with late fruit. It happened in a heartbeat. From the wall of alder to her left, a violent burst of motion erupted. A massive Kodiak bear, its fur wet and dark, exploding from the brush in a spray of leaves and broken branches. The sound was like a freight train, a guttural roar ripping through the forest as it charged, head low, shoulders rolling, eyes fixed on her. The weight of its presence seemed to crush the air, the ground shuddering under its strides. Anna froze. Her mind screamed to run, but her body locked, feet rooted in the soft earth. She barely had time to raise her hands before the bear hit, the impact knocking her flat on her back, the pack slamming hard into the ground beneath her. The stink of wet fur and fish filled her nose, the animal's hot breath washing over her face. Its massive paw swiped down, claws tearing into her jacket and scraping the skin beneath, the blow forcing the air from her lungs and leaving a searing pain in her side. Mark and Brian heard the roar before they saw her. They spun, rifles snapping to their shoulders, and charged through the brush toward the sound. Anna could hear the thudding of their boots over the bear's rumbling growls, then the thunder of the first shot. A blast into the air, not at the animal. The bear's head jerked toward the noise, lips curling back to reveal teeth the length of her fingers, but it didn't retreat. Brian fired a second warning shot, the crack echoing off the trees, and the bear finally reared back, a deep bellow rolling from its chest before it turned, crashing back into the dense tangle of alders. Anna lay still for a moment, her vision swimming, her breath ragged. Her jacket was torn wide across the chest, her shirt beneath stained with blood from shallow but burning claw marks. Her left hip throbbed from where the bear had knocked her sideways, and her legs felt weak and unsteady. When Mark tried to help her stand, her knees buckled instantly, the strength gone from her body. They were several kilometers from the nearest point where help could reach them, and the trail back was rough, winding through thick stands of spruce and slippery ravines. Mark slung his rifle across his back and knelt, motioning for her to climb onto his shoulders. But after a few hundred meters, the strain of the uneven ground and her weight forced them to switch, Brian taking his turn. The forest seemed to close in around them as they moved, every shadow a possible threat, every crack of a branch making their eyes dart to the tree line. The hours dragged, each step a test of endurance. Anna drifted in and out of awareness, the rhythmic sway of being carried blending with the pounding of her pulse in her ears. Her body ached with every movement, her side burning from the claw marks, and her head felt thick and heavy. She could feel the cold beginning to seep into her limbs despite the warmth of her father's jacket draped around her. Mark and Brian kept a brutal pace, their breathing harsh in the still air, pausing only to listen for movement in the brush. At one point, the sharp snap of a twig far off to their right made both men stop dead, rifles raised, scanning the green shadows for any sign of the bear returning. The sound faded, leaving only the rush of the stream behind them, but the tension never left. When they finally reached the edge of a narrow service road, the last light was fading from the sky, the treetops turning black against the deepening blue. A fellow hunter, alerted by radio earlier, was waiting with a truck, and together they eased Anna into the passenger seat, wrapping her in blankets and checking her wounds. Her face was pale and drawn, but she was breathing evenly now, the shock beginning to lift. At the clinic in Kodiak later that night, the doctor confirmed she had no broken bones but plenty of deep bruising, scratches, and a mild concussion from the impact. She was lucky, they said. If the bear had meant to kill, it would have. The swipes alone, if angled differently, could have torn deep enough to end her life. In the weeks that followed, Anna's body healed, but the memory of the attack remained vivid, the speed of the charge, the crushing weight of the bear over her, the sheer power in the blow that had thrown her like a rag doll. She thought often about the fact that she had been unarmed, about how little chance she would have had without her father and uncle so close. She returned to the mountains the next year, this time carrying her own rifle, her steps more measured, her eyes sharper. But she knew, with a clarity that never faded, that Kodiak's wilderness was a place where even the strongest hunter could be humbled in seconds, and where survival often depended on the narrowest margin between action and disaster. On October 29, 2021, the pre-dawn cold in rural Pennsylvania sank deep into the earth, the kind that clung to skin and turned every breath into a faint cloud. Jake Hollis, a 31-year-old mechanic and lifelong deer hunter, eased into his ground blind before sunrise, the damp scent of fallen leaves heavy in the still air. It was peak rut when mature bucks grew reckless. His blind, built from weathered wood panels, sat at the edge of a field bordered by thick hardwoods, a natural funnel for deer at first light. The morning was silent but for the faint rustle of dry leaves. Jake's rifle rested across his knees as he scanned the tree line. Every sound, a creak, a snap, set his senses taut. Then, just as faint light brushed the field, movement caught his eye. A massive 12-point buck stepping from the woods. Its antlers were thick and wide, each tine gleaming faintly, its chest broad, neck swollen from the rut. Every exhale was a white puff in the cold air. Jake's pulse quickened as he began to raise the rifle slowly, but the buck suddenly froze, its ears pinning back, hair bristling along its spine. Its gaze locked on the blind, not on a rival or a doe, on him. It lowered its head, antlers angled forward, and charged. The sound was explosive, rapid pounding hooves, the deep snort of breath, then a bone-rattling crash as antlers slammed into the blind's wall. The impact splintered the panels and the whole frame shuddering violently. Jake was thrown sideways, the rifle skidding out of reach with a metallic clang. The buck pulled back and struck again, each blow sending sharp cracks through the air. Wood splintered, the front wall buckling. Jake tried to scramble to his feet, but the narrow space in the collapsing wall pinned him back. The animal's sheer size and fury were overwhelming, its muscles bunching with every lunge, hooves scraping for traction. One final slam shattered the wall completely. The buck lunged into the opening, thrashing antlers in the cramped space. A tine drove into Jake's left shoulder, cutting through his jacket and into flesh. Pain exploded down his arm as the force spun him into the rear wall. He hit the floor, breath knocked out, vision flashing white. Instinct took over. Gritting his teeth, he rolled sideways, shoving himself through a gap in the back wall. Leaves crunched under his boots as he stumbled into the open. Behind him, the buck wheeled sharply, nostrils flaring, antlers swinging like hooked blades. His rifle was still in the blind, out of reach. The buck charged again, closing the distance in seconds. Jake drew his sidearm, his wounded arm screaming, and fired once into the ground in front of the animal. The sharp crack echoed through the woods. The buck halted, head tossing, muscles quivering. Steam rose from its body in the freezing air. Then it spun and bounded toward the tree line, vanishing in the brush with snapping twigs and pounding hooves. The silence afterward felt unnatural. Jake pressed his hand to his shoulder, feeling the warm slickness of blood soaking through his shirt. The wound burned, but the bleeding was steady, not spurting. He could make it to his truck if he kept moving. The walk out was slow, each step sending a dull throb through his arm. He kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting the buck to return. The cold bit into his lungs, crows called in the distance, and every shadow seemed alive. When he finally reached the truck, the relief was almost enough to dull the pain. At the clinic later that morning, the doctor cleaned and stitched the wound, noting the tine had missed bone and major arteries by inches. Bruising across his ribs and hip told the story of the blind's collapse and the blows inside it. Physically, he'd heal, but the force of the attack was burned into his memory. Word spread fast among local hunters. Bucks could be aggressive during the rut, posturing, sparring, chasing, but few remembered one so violently targeting a blind with a hunter inside. Some thought it mistook the blind for a rival. Others said rut-fueled rage made anything in its path a target. For Jake, the why mattered less than the reality. He replayed the moments in his mind, the way the buck's eyes locked on him, the first impact's raw force, the shattering wood, the crushing weight of the animal. The morning had turned from quiet anticipation to a fight for survival in seconds, the blind becoming a trap instead of a shield. Weeks later, when he returned to the field, the remains of the blind lay scattered under frost. The front panels were shattered, the frame twisted beyond repair. The tracks had faded, but he could still hear the pounding hooves in his head, feel the blind shudder under the buck's fury. That season, he rebuilt the blind stronger, but the memory stayed sharp. On that cold October morning, he learned that the fiercest fight could come from the animal you least expect. And in those moments, survival hangs on instinct, speed, and a sliver of luck. On the night of September 6, 2018, the wilderness of Russia's Ussuri Krai lay under a thin mist, the air cold enough to sharpen every breath. The forest here was ancient, its dark valleys and ridges filled with tangled spruce, birch, and massive ferns that clawed at passing boots. This remote part of the Russian Far East had always been a place where predators reigned, especially the Ussuri brown bear, a cousin of the Kamchatka grizzly and nearly as large as the coastal Alaskan giants. Viktor Malenkov, 54, a wealthy businessman from Vladivostok, had come seeking one of these legendary bears. He was not inexperienced. He'd hunted red stag in New Zealand, lions in Namibia, but here he relied on his hired guide, Alexei Petrov, a wiry 43-year-old with 20 years of Far East hunting under his belt. Alexei carried a .338 Lapua, the long black barrel worn from years in the field. Victor had brought his prized .375 H&H, gleaming even in the low light, more a symbol of status than a workhorse. Their camp was set in a sheltered hollow near a slow river bend where salmon runs often drew bears in late summer. Victor had paid for comfort. Canvas tents with raised cots, battery-powered lanterns, a collapsible dining table, and even imported coffee. A generator hummed quietly by the gear tent. The fire pit was ringed with smooth stones, still warm from the evening's meal of grilled taimen. By midnight, the forest was a black wall beyond the lantern glow. Alexei remained awake, sitting by the fire with his rifle across his lap. The darkness here was absolute, broken only by the hiss of cooling embers and the faint rippling of the river. Somewhere deep in the trees, an owl called. Farther off, branches cracked, not with the light snap of deer hooves, but a deeper, heavier cadence. Alexei stiffened. The sound came again, wood splintering under weight, the slow, deliberate push of something massive moving through undergrowth, then silence. He rose slowly, eyes straining into the blackness. The night air carried a faint, sharp scent, musky, heavy, unmistakable. Bear. It happened in a sudden burst. From the tree line, a hulking shadow exploded forward, low to the ground but impossibly fast. The bear was enormous, its shoulders rolling like living machinery, fur dark and matted from river spray. The guide had seconds. He shouldered the .338 and fired into the air. The gun's concussion cracked across the valley, but the bear did not falter. It smashed into the gear tent first, flattening crates and scattering supplies in an eruption of nylon, fabric, and metal. Lanterns toppled, their lights spinning wildly across the chaos. The generator skidded across the dirt, choking out. Alexei fired again, this time aiming just above the animal, trying to drive it off without wounding it unnecessarily, a risk in these remote forests where a wounded grizzly often became far more dangerous. But this bear was not bluffing. With terrifying precision, it swung toward Victor's tent. The thick canvas bulged as the sleeping man stirred, confused by the noise. Before he could rise, the bear's weight came down. Claws the length of carving knives ripped through fabric, wood, and flesh in a single brutal motion. The tent collapsed under the impact, caving in around its occupant. Alexei's instincts screamed at him to close in, but the scene was chaos. The bear's bulk shifting under the tent, growls vibrating through the ground, the sickening sounds of violence. He fired once more, the shot slicing past the bear's flank and kicking up dirt. The animal paused, muscles tensing, then wrenched free of the canvas, its muzzle wet and steaming in the cold night. It swung its head toward the guide, eyes catching the flicker of dying firelight. For a heartbeat, Alexei thought it would charge him. Instead, the bear turned and vanished into the tree line, the forest swallowing its massive form with a final crash of undergrowth. The camp was left in ruin. Smoke curled from the fire's embers, mingling with the metallic tang of blood. Alexei dropped to his knees beside the collapsed tent, tearing away the shredded fabric. Victor lay still, his chest unmoving. The force of the attack had been instant and final. Alexei sat back, breathing hard, his hands shaking despite years of seeing what large predators could do. This was not a careless mistake, it was a reminder of where they were. Here, the hunter was never truly in control. Through the rest of the night, Alexei stayed alert, rifle in hand, lantern light casting long shadows. Every sound in the trees set his nerves on edge. The bear did not return, but its presence lingered, its prints deep in the soft soil, the claw marks gouged into broken crates, the musk still hanging in the air. At first light, Alexei used the satellite phone to contact rangers stationed 2 days away. He gave them the coordinates, his voice steady only through force of will. The reply was short: "Stay armed. Do not attempt to move the body until they arrive." 2 days in this place felt like weeks. Crows gathered by mid-morning, their calls echoing through the valley. Alexei built a makeshift perimeter with the remaining gear, not to stop a bear but to give himself warning. At night he kept small fires burning on all sides, their smoke drifting upward into the cold air. Sleep came in moments, shallow and restless, broken by every creak and whisper in the forest. The Rangers arrived on September 8th, moving quietly but with rifles ready. Their expressions hardened when they saw the camp. They examined the ground tracks leading in from the river, wide and deep, each print the size of a dinner plate. The bear had likely been following the salmon run, drawn by the scent of fish and cooking meat. The attack, they said, was direct and deliberate. They wrapped Victor's body in a tarp and prepared it for evacuation. The Rangers took photographs of the scene, collected what supplies they could salvage, and advised Alexei to leave the area immediately. By that afternoon, the camp was nothing but flattened grass and broken wood, the smell of smoke and blood fading into the damp air. The forest reclaimed its silence, but to Alexei, it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, more watchful. News of the attack spread quickly through hunting circles and beyond. Many criticized the choice to cook openly near a salmon stream during peak bear activity. Others noted that in Ussuri Krai, no level of preparation could fully erase the risk. Even the best rifles and the most experienced guides sometimes had seconds to act, and sometimes seconds were not enough. For Alexei, the memories remained sharp: the first sound of branches breaking, the black mass erupting from the tree line, the shocking speed, the way gunfire seemed meaningless against something so committed. In the wilderness, even luxury meant nothing when measured against the raw force of a grizzly determined to kill. In the years that followed, he avoided that valley entirely. The ridges and rivers of Ussuri Krai were still his home, but that hollow by the slow bend became a place he would not enter, even in daylight. The bear, if it still lived, would roam unseen among the endless trees, a shadow, a presence, and a reminder carved deep into the memory of the man who survived that night. On the evening of November 12th, 2023, deep in the mountains of central Idaho, the land lay shrouded in the quiet gloom of fading light, the sun slipping behind rugged ridges and dense stands of lodgepole pine. The air was cold, crisp with a faint bite that whispered the coming winter. Beneath the lowering sky, the ground was a patchwork of frozen mud, fallen needles, and brittle leaves, muffling the footsteps of 2 hunters who had spent the day stalking a massive bull elk. Mark Reynolds, 42, was lean and weathered from years of guiding and hunting in the Rocky Mountains. His eyes, sharp and steady, scanned the darkening horizon as he clutched his .300 Winchester rifle. Beside him, Nate Collins, 37, carried the calm confidence of a former park ranger, his movements deliberate and practiced as he followed Mark's lead. They had tracked the elk over rocky ridges and through tangled brush, signs growing fresher with each mile. Broken branches, deep hoofprints pressed into soft earth, and the pungent musk of a bull in rut. As the last pale light bled from the sky, Mark finally caught sight of the elk, standing still in a small clearing near a creek, its massive antlers silhouetted against the dimming forest. Steeling himself, Mark raised his rifle, heart steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. He waited for the bull to shift into a perfect position, then squeezed the trigger. The shot echoed through the silent trees, reverberating off the rocky cliffs. The bull staggered, muscles rippling under thick fur, then collapsed heavily, the earth shaking beneath its bulk. Mark and Nate moved quickly, knowing the window before darkness would close. Using headlamps that cut swaths of white light through the gloom, they began to quarter the elk, knives flashing as they worked efficiently to prepare the meat for transport. The forest around them was alive with shadows and subtle noises, the distant murmur of the creek, the rustle of branches stirred by wind, the occasional call of a night bird. Then suddenly a low, haunting howl rose behind them, sharp and cold against the silence. It was answered by another, then another, multiple voices blending into a chorus of primal sound that chilled the hunter's bones. Mark froze, his eyes darting to the dark ridge beyond the clearing. Nate's hand instinctively moved to his rifle as the hair along his neck stood on end. The howls grew closer, weaving through the trees like invisible threads, wrapping the hunters in tension and unease. From the timber emerged a large shadow, eyes glinting fiercely in the beam of their headlamps. The alpha wolf stepped boldly into view, its muscular frame tall and commanding as it stood atop a small rise overlooking the kill. Behind it, 5 more wolves emerged silently, their lithe bodies slipping between the trees, circling the downed elk with calculated grace. The hunters' breaths quickened. Mark raised his rifle and fired a warning shot high into the air. The crack shattered the stillness, echoing through the valleys and hills, but the wolves did not flinch. Instead, their snarls deepened, low and guttural, bodies lowering into stalking postures. The alpha's commanding presence spurred the pack forward, no hint of fear in their eyes, only hunger and the unyielding claim to the kill. Realizing the overwhelming odds, Mark and Nate slowly backed away, rifles trained on the wolves as they retreated from the clearing. Mark quickly activated his GPS, marking the precise location of the kill before vanishing into the safety of the forest's dark embrace. The wolves watched silently, unbothered by the humans' withdrawal, settling in immediately to feast. Morning broke cold and gray over the wilderness. The hunters returned with first light, their breaths misting in the frigid air. The clearing was barren. Where the elk had fallen, only tufts of coarse, dark hair lay scattered, mingled with splintered bone fragments and shattered hooves. The ground was churned and trampled, a clear testament to the wolves' presence. This was not mere scavenging. The wolves had been there as the elk fell, waiting silently, watching the humans' movements and ready to claim what had always belonged to them. The night's haunting howls, the boldness of the alpha, the pack's patience. It was a reminder of a wild balance that humans could never fully control. For Mark and Nate, the encounter was sobering. The forest was not simply their hunting ground, it was shared territory where predator and prey lived by rules older than any man-made law. The dance of survival was constant, and sometimes the hunter was not the only one stalking the wild. Days later, they returned with heavier gear to retrieve what they could of the elk, finding the site little changed. Only bones bleached white by the snow and wind. The wolves had left little behind, their efficiency a testament to their skill and hunger. Mark thought often of that night, the low howl that shattered the stillness, the ghostly eyes that watched from the dark, the silence that followed their retreat. In those moments, the wild had reminded them all of its power, its unyielding will. In the dense forests and rocky ridges of Idaho's backcountry, the wolves ruled the night, and sometimes they took the kill.